It all started when my wife, Sarah, and I received an invitation to a swinger party hosted by her boss, Mark, and his wife, Jessica. The idea seemed outrageous at first, but we had both been feeling stuck in a routine, and there was this quiet curiosity simmering beneath the surface. We had always been adventurous, and the taboo allure of trying something so wild and different pulled us in. We set clear boundaries, just once, nothing more, and never again. We promised each other that it would be a shared experience to spice things up and nothing more. The night of the party, nerves tingled in the air as we dressed. Sarah looked stunning in a black cocktail dress, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. She glanced at me, her smile a mix of excitement and uncertainty. We reassured each other, exchanging a kiss that lingered a little longer than usual, as if sealing our pact. Upon arriving at the luxurious house, the atmosphere was charged with an unmistakable sense of forbidden excitement. Couples mingled in small groups, the air filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of sensual music. It felt like we were stepping into another world, one where the usual rules didn't apply. Jessica, Mark's wife, greeted us with a playful smile. She was stunning, confident, with sharp eyes and an allure that was hard to ignore. Jessica wasted no time flirting with me, her hand lightly touching my arm as she laughed at my jokes, her gaze lingering a bit too long. I glanced at Sarah, who was engaged in conversation with Mark across the room. For a moment, everything seemed fine. We were just having fun, exploring our boundaries. But then Jessica leaned closer, her perfume intoxicating. "You and Sarah are really brave to come here," she whispered, her voice laced with something daring. I could feel her testing the waters, seeing how far she could push. Before I knew it, we were in a private room, and things escalated quickly. Jessica's boldness ignited something in me. The thrill of the moment, the risk, the breaking of boundaries, it was all a rush. I knew it was a one-time thing, just like Sarah and I had agreed, so I let myself get lost in it. As I finished, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, exhilaration mixed with a twinge of guilt. I hurried to find Sarah, wanting to make sure she was okay. After all, we had made a pact, and I wanted to ensure she was having a good time. But she was nowhere in sight. I roamed through the rooms, heart pounding as I pushed open doors and scanned the crowd. Finally, I found her. She was in a dimly lit room with Mark, lying on the bed together. I hesitated, my feet frozen in place. They were close, wrapped in an intimate embrace that felt too familiar, too comfortable. It was more than just a physical act. There was something about the way Sarah was snuggled up against him, her head resting on his chest, that set off alarm bells in my mind. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal that I struggled to suppress. I waited until they finished, standing quietly in the shadows, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. When Mark finally moved away, Sarah looked up and saw me standing there. She got up quickly, her expression a mix of embarrassment and guilt. "Are you okay?" she asked, as if she was genuinely concerned about my feelings. We left the party without saying much, the silence between us heavy. In the car, she started talking, sharing her emotions openly. She described the thrill, the fear, and how she felt a mix of excitement and shame. I shared my own thoughts, trying to navigate the confusing swirl of feelings that had taken over me. The next morning, I thought we had put it all behind us. It was an experience, a one-time thing, just as we had agreed. But as the day went on, I noticed something strange. Sarah was anxious, checking her phone frequently, and seemed distracted. Then, just before lunch, she rushed out, saying she had been urgently called to work. That struck me as odd. Sarah had never been the type to drop everything for work, especially not on a Sunday. Curiosity turned into suspicion. My mind raced back to last night, to the way Sarah had looked with Mark, to how she hadn't been the same since we left that party. Something wasn't right, and deep down, I knew this was far from over. The unease from the party lingered, gnawing at me. Sarah had never been secretive, she was always straightforward and dependable. But that morning, she was acting strangely, fidgety, distracted, and too eager to leave. When she said she had to go into work urgently, it didn't sit right with me. I decided to follow her, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I told myself it was just paranoia, the remnants of last night's emotions clouding my judgment, but the nagging doubt wouldn't let go. I kept my distance as I tailed her to her office building downtown. I watched from a nearby cafe as she hurried inside, looking back over her shoulder as if checking to make sure she hadn't been followed. My heart sank. I had never seen her so nervous. I wanted to confront her then and there, but I knew I needed proof, something concrete to explain this sinking feeling in my chest. Unable to get past the building's security, I called my friend Dave, who worked on the same floor as Sarah. Dave was always up for some mischief, and when I told him I needed a favor, he didn't hesitate. "Keep an eye on Sarah for me," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just see what she's up to." Dave agreed, sensing something was off without me having to explain much. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Dave. His voice was hesitant, loaded with the kind of tension that only bad news brings. "Man, I saw Sarah," he said, pausing as if trying to find the right words. "She's not working, she's with Mark." My stomach dropped. They went into his office and, look, I don't know how to say this, but they're not exactly discussing reports in there. I felt a mix of rage and despair surge through me. It wasn't just the sex that stung, it was the betrayal, the breaking of the promise we had made to each other. We had agreed, just once, nothing more. But Sarah had crossed that line. My mind raced back to the image of her cuddling with Mark at the party, the way they had been so close, and it all made a twisted kind of sense now. She wasn't just physically attracted to him, there was something deeper, something that had pulled her back into his arms despite our agreement. Unable to stand the thought of them together, I drove away, my mind reeling. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. By the time Sarah came home, I had already decided what I needed to do next. I kept my composure, pretending everything was normal as she kissed me hello and went on about her day. But I couldn't look at her the same way. The next day, I called Dave again, desperate for more information. "I'm sorry, man, but it's getting worse," Dave said, his voice heavy. "They're meeting every day now. It's not just a fling, it's like they're in a relationship." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I felt sick, my thoughts spiraling into dark places. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We had only agreed to explore once, together, and now she was sneaking around with Mark like they were some kind of twisted couple. I couldn't let this go unanswered. She had broken our trust, and I was determined to make sure she understood the gravity of what she'd done. But I needed to plan my next move carefully. Revenge was the only thing on my mind. Revenge on Sarah, on Mark, on the whole twisted situation they dragged me into. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Every morning, Sarah left early, always with some excuse about work, meetings, or errands. I didn't bother asking anymore. I just watched her go, knowing exactly where she was headed and who she was going to be with. It tore me apart inside, but I kept my cool, biding my time. Then one night as Sarah lay asleep next to me, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Mark. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was incredible." My blood boiled. I grabbed the phone, scrolling through their messages, each one more explicit than the last. They talked about their secret rendezvous, their shared fantasies, and how much they couldn't get enough of each other. I saw messages mocking me, laughing about how oblivious I was. It was humiliating. My wife, the woman I loved, was treating me like a joke behind my back. The betrayal was complete. I knew I couldn't just sit back and let this continue. They had crossed a line, and now it was time for payback. I started planning how I would make them both regret what they had done. I wasn't going to be the victim in their sordid little game. This was just the beginning. After discovering Sarah's ongoing affair with Mark, I was devastated. I tried to act normal around her, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was her betrayal. The playful flirts, the stolen moments, they haunted me. She thought she had me fooled, that I was just her clueless husband, but I knew exactly what was going on. And now, I had to decide what to do next. I couldn't let it go, but I also couldn't just confront her. She'd lie, twist things around, and maybe even try to pin it all on me. No, if I was going to get even, I needed to be smarter. I decided to hit her where it would hurt the most, her relationship with Mark. I reached out to Jessica, Mark's wife. She was a crucial piece in all of this, and if I could get her on my side, it would shake up Sarah and Mark's little world. I texted Jessica under the pretense of wanting to catch up after the swinger party. Jessica had been flirty with me before, and I knew she might be open to talking. We met at a quiet bar a few days later, and it didn't take long for the conversation to turn personal. Jessica was sharp, observant, and clearly unhappy in her marriage. "Mark's always busy with work," she said, swirling her wine glass as she spoke. "And when he's not, he's always on his phone, handling business." She rolled her eyes, and I could sense the bitterness in her voice. I played my part carefully, steering the conversation toward the idea that Mark might be hiding something. Jessica was curious, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. She asked questions, probed a little, and I gave her just enough to keep her interested. I didn't mention Sarah yet. Instead, I painted Mark as the unfaithful husband, hinting that he was probably cheating on her without outright saying it. Jessica was sharp. It didn't take her long to catch on. "Do you think he's seeing someone?" she asked, her tone almost casual, but her eyes were searching. I hesitated for effect, then nodded slightly. "I don't have proof," I said, "but I wouldn't be surprised." The seeds of doubt were planted, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Jessica started snooping on her own. I watched as she processed my words, anger flickering in her eyes. She was more than ready to confront Mark, and I didn't need to push her any further. Over the next week, Jessica and I stayed in touch. I made sure to keep Sarah in the dark about my meetings with Jessica. She didn't suspect a thing. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her daily trysts with Mark, thinking she was getting away with it. I kept playing the role of the unsuspecting husband, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jessica called me one evening, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. "I found texts," she said, barely able to keep her composure, "between Mark and someone at work. It's been going on for months." She didn't say Sarah's name, but I knew exactly who she was talking about. The affair was out in the open now, and Jessica was furious. "Are you okay?" I asked, pretending to be concerned. Jessica was livid, talking about how she was going to confront Mark and how she couldn't believe he had been cheating on her right under her nose. I listened, all the while knowing that this was just the beginning of the fallout. Jessica's confrontation with Mark was explosive. She didn't hold back, tearing into him with all the anger of a scorned wife who had just discovered the truth. Sarah tried to mediate, but it only made things worse. Jessica turned on her, accusing her of being the other woman, and throwing all of Mark's lies in her face. Sarah was caught off guard. She hadn't expected to be outed like this, especially not by Jessica. Mark was furious, not just at Jessica but at Sarah, too. The tension between them was palpable, and I watched as their once secretive affair turned into a public disaster. Sarah's guilt and shame were written all over her face, and I took a twisted sense of satisfaction in seeing her squirm. But my revenge wasn't complete yet. I had one more move to make, one that would hit Mark where it hurt the most: his career. I anonymously sent the evidence of Mark's financial misdeeds to his company's board. The fallout was immediate. Mark was suspended, his reputation destroyed. Jessica filed for divorce, armed with everything she needed to take him down. As for Sarah, she was left with nothing but the wreckage of her affair. Mark was no longer the powerful, untouchable boss she had fallen for. He was just a man caught in his own lies, and she was part of the mess. She tried to talk to me, to explain, but I shut her out. I didn't need her apologies or her excuses. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. I had played my part perfectly, pulling the strings from behind the scenes while they all self-destructed. And while it didn't heal the wounds Sarah had inflicted, watching her world crumble was the closest thing to closure I could get. Mark's downfall happened quicker than I could have hoped. The evidence I sent to his company's board was like a grenade, blowing apart his carefully constructed image. Word spread fast: embezzlement, fraud, and shady deals. He went from being the confident, untouchable boss to a disgraced executive with lawsuits piling up. Mark tried to deny everything, but the proof was too damning. It wasn't just his career that was unraveling, it was his entire life. Jessica wasted no time filing for divorce. She was ruthless, using every bit of evidence I had given her to strip Mark of his assets. She wasn't interested in reconciliation, she wanted to bury him. Mark's lawyers tried to fight back, but Jessica was relentless. Every day, new details of Mark's affairs and financial misdeeds came to light, and his once loyal friends and colleagues quickly turned their backs on him. For Sarah, things were just as bad. She hadn't spoken much since the confrontation with Jessica. At home, she was a shadow of her former self, quiet, withdrawn, and avoiding eye contact. I could see the weight of her decisions pressing down on her, and I took satisfaction in knowing she was feeling the same pain she had inflicted on me. I kept my distance, only speaking to her when necessary, maintaining a cold civility that drove home the message: we were done. One morning, Sarah finally broke the silence. "I messed up," she said quietly, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red, and she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "I never meant for it to go this far." I didn't respond immediately. I let her words hang in the air, taking in the desperation in her voice. "You knew exactly what you were doing," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. "We had an agreement, and you broke it. Over and over." Sarah flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't think. I got caught up in it. I was stupid." "You think this is about being stupid?" I snapped, finally letting some of my anger show. "You lied to me. You went behind my back. This wasn't some mistake, Sarah. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. A part of me wanted to comfort her, to forgive her, but I couldn't. The betrayal was too deep. We had shared everything: dreams, plans, promises, and she had thrown it all away for a man who was now nothing more than a disgraced cheater. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in Mark and Sarah's affair widened into chasms. Mark, now jobless and in the middle of a nasty divorce, had no time or energy left for Sarah. He stopped responding to her messages, and I could see the panic in her eyes every time her phone stayed silent. She was losing him too. One evening, Sarah tried to talk to me again, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. "I was unhappy and he was exciting. He made me feel wanted." I stared at her, feeling the familiar sting of betrayal. "So what? You were bored? That's your excuse?" I shook my head, unable to contain my disgust. "You could have talked to me. You could have done anything but this." She looked away, guilt etched on her face. "I know, I messed up, but I still love you." Her words hung heavy, but they felt hollow. The love she was talking about was tainted, broken beyond repair. "Maybe you do," I said, "but it's not enough." That night, I packed a bag and left. I needed space, away from the memories, the lies, and the constant reminders of what had happened. I checked into a hotel, needing time to think, to figure out my next steps. I didn't tell Sarah where I was going. I didn't owe her that anymore. While I was gone, Jessica reached out. She wanted to meet up, just to talk. We met at a cafe, and for the first time, I saw her without the anger and bitterness that had consumed her during the divorce. She looked relieved, almost at peace with the chaos that had unfolded. We shared stories about Mark and Sarah, laughing bitterly at the irony of it all. Two betrayed spouses, left picking up the pieces of their broken marriages. As we talked, I realized that I felt more comfortable with Jessica than I had with anyone in a long time. We both understood the pain of betrayal, and there was an unspoken connection between us, a bond forged in shared suffering. We spent hours together, just talking, and for the first time since the whole mess started, I felt something resembling peace. After that, Jessica and I continued to see each other. It wasn't romantic, at least not at first. It was more about finding solace in someone who truly understood. We were both still reeling from the wreckage of our relationships, but slowly, the bitterness began to fade. We supported each other, leaning on the friendship that had formed from the ashes of our failed marriages. Meanwhile, Sarah was left alone to deal with the fallout of her choices. She tried to fix things with Mark, but he was too busy dealing with his own mess to care. She was isolated, stuck in the ruins of the life she had built on lies. It was the exact punishment she deserved, one that I didn't have to deliver personally. The consequences of her actions were doing all the work for me. As time went on, I realized that revenge had been a double-edged sword. It had given me some satisfaction, but it hadn't erased the pain. I had lost the woman I thought I knew, and no amount of payback could change that. But at least now, I was no longer carrying the weight of her betrayal alone. I had found someone who understood, and in that, I found a sliver of hope for the future. My life had changed drastically since I left home. Days turned into weeks as I stayed at the hotel, away from the toxic environment that Sarah and I had created. I spent my time reflecting on everything: the swinger party, Sarah's affair with Mark, and the path that had led us here. The anger I felt initially began to fade, replaced by a sense of emptiness. Revenge had been a temporary high, but now I was left with the reality of what my life had become. One morning, I woke up to a missed call from Sarah. She had left a voicemail, her voice shaky and desperate. "I know you're angry and I don't blame you. But we need to talk, please." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies or excuses. Not yet. Instead, I continued to meet with Jessica. Our casual friendship had become a lifeline. We met up regularly, often just to share a meal or have a drink, finding comfort in each other's company. It felt good to be around someone who wasn't trying to manipulate or deceive me. Jessica was honest, direct, and as broken as I was, and that made her easy to be with. One evening, as we sat at a quiet bar, Jessica turned to me, her expression serious. "Have you thought about what comes next? For you and Sarah, I mean." I shrugged, staring at my glass. "I'm not sure there is a next for us. She crossed a line I don't think I can forgive." I paused, considering my words carefully. "We made a deal, and she broke it. It's not just about the affair. It's about the betrayal of everything we promised each other." Jessica nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get it. I'm still processing what Mark did too. It's not just the cheating, it's the lies, the disrespect. But you can't live in this space forever." I knew she was right. At some point, I would have to confront Sarah and decide what the rest of my life would look like. As much as I wanted to avoid it, I couldn't run from this forever. A few days later, I finally returned to the house. Sarah was sitting in the living room when I walked in, looking like she hadn't slept in days. The tension was thick, and I could feel the weight of all the unspoken words between us. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. "You came back," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," I replied, keeping my distance. "We need to talk." We sat across from each other, the silence stretching out like a chasm. Sarah tried to explain herself, fumbling over her words as she recounted how she got involved with Mark. She admitted to feeling trapped in our routine, craving excitement and validation that she hadn't found at home. But none of it sounded like a good enough reason. She kept saying she never meant to hurt me, but the damage was done. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't even know why I kept going back." I listened, but her explanations felt hollow. "You kept going back because you wanted to," I said bluntly. "You chose him over and over, knowing what it would do to us." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But I miss us. I miss you." I wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, anything, but all I felt was numb. The Sarah sitting in front of me wasn't the woman I had married. She was someone I barely recognized, and I realized in that moment that I couldn't go back to the way things were. There was no way to undo the betrayal, no way to unsee the things I had seen. "I miss what we had too," I admitted, my voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I can forgive you." Sarah broke down again, sobbing into her hands. I stood up, unable to watch her cry any longer. I felt sorry for her, but I also knew that I couldn't let sympathy cloud my judgment. She had made her choices, and now we both had to live with the consequences. Later that night, I met up with Jessica again, needing an escape from the heaviness that hung over me at home. We walked along the waterfront, the cool breeze whipping through the air as we talked about everything and nothing. Being with Jessica felt easy, uncomplicated, like a breath of fresh air after the suffocating tension at home. "You did the right thing," Jessica said as we stopped to watch the waves crash against the rocks. Sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward. I nodded, appreciating her words. Jessica had been through her own storm, and she was slowly rebuilding her life from the wreckage of her marriage. Seeing her find her strength gave me hope that I could do the same. We stood there in silence for a while, watching the water and finding solace in the quiet. But as much as I valued Jessica's company, I knew I had to face the reality of my own situation. I couldn't keep hiding behind her friendship forever. I had to decide whether to stay with Sarah or walk away for good. The next morning, I went back to the house, determined to have one final conversation with Sarah. We sat down, and I told her everything: how her affair with Mark had broken me, how our agreement had meant nothing once she decided to pursue him. I laid it all out raw and unfiltered, letting her see the full extent of the hurt she had caused. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "And I'm not sure I want to." Sarah looked at me, her face a mix of regret and resignation. "I love you," she whispered, but the words felt empty. They weren't enough to fix what was broken between us. I left the house that day, not knowing if I would come back. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. Not because things were resolved, but because I was finally ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant starting over without Sarah. After that last conversation with Sarah, I needed space, clarity, anything that would help me make sense of the tangled mess my life had become. I had already left home once, but this time it felt different. I wasn't running away, I was letting go. And more than anything, I wanted to feel something other than betrayal and disappointment. Jessica had been my rock through all of this, and as much as I tried to keep things platonic, the connection between us was undeniable. We continued meeting up, our conversations deepening with each encounter. Jessica and I shared more than just the pain of our broken marriages. We shared a genuine bond, one that felt like a spark in the darkness. Every time I was with her, it felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself that I had lost in the chaos. The attraction between us had been there from the start, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was becoming impossible to ignore. One night, Jessica invited me over to her place. She had just finalized her divorce from Mark, and she was in a celebratory mood. We sat on her balcony, overlooking the city lights, sipping wine and talking about everything we'd been through. Jessica was freer now, unburdened by the lies and deceit that had defined her marriage. She laughed easily, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen before. "I can't believe it's finally over," she said, leaning back in her chair. "No more Mark, no more lies. It feels liberating." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's like you can finally breathe again." She glanced at me, her smile fading into something more serious. "What about you? Have you figured out what you're going to do?" I shrugged, not wanting to admit that I was still torn. "I don't know. I don't think there's anything left to save with Sarah, but it's hard to walk away from everything we've built." Jessica reached out and took my hand, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "You deserve better," she said softly. "We both do." We sat there in silence, her hand still in mine, and for the first time in months, I felt a pull that I couldn't resist. Jessica's presence was like a balm, soothing the raw wounds left by Sarah's betrayal. She leaned closer, and before I knew it, our lips met. It was gentle at first, tentative, but as the kiss deepened, the pent-up desire between us surged forward, unstoppable. We moved inside, the tension between us building with every step. Clothes were discarded hastily, and soon we were tangled up in each other on her bed. It was different from anything I'd felt with Sarah. There was no guilt, no hidden agendas, just raw, honest passion. Jessica's touch was urgent, and I lost myself in her completely, all the anger and frustration melting away in the heat of the moment. But as we were caught up in each other, the sound of the front door slamming jolted us both out of our reverie. I barely had time to react before Mark stormed into the room, his face twisted in rage. He must have still had a key, and the sight of me with Jessica sent him over the edge. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark roared, his voice echoing through the room as he lunged at me. Before I could respond, he swung his fist, catching me off guard. I staggered back, my mind racing. The room erupted into chaos as Jessica screamed, trying to pull Mark off me, but he was fueled by a blind fury. I fought back, adrenaline surging as I grappled with him. We crashed into the dresser, knocking over a lamp as we struggled. Mark was bigger, but I was fueled by months of pent-up anger and betrayal. I landed a solid punch to his jaw, and he stumbled, momentarily stunned. "Is this what you do, Mark?" I shouted, shoving him back. "You destroy everything you touch?" Mark recovered quickly, charging at me again. We collided, and this time, I managed to get the upper hand, pinning him against the wall. "You took my wife," he spat, his face contorted with rage. "You ruined everything. You did that all on your own." I shot back, my grip tightening. "This is on you." Jessica was frantic, pleading with us to stop, but Mark wasn't done. He broke free and swung at me again, but I ducked, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him out of the room. We tumbled into the hallway, trading blows as we crashed into walls and furniture. Mark's anger was feral, his punches wild, but I stayed focused, every hit bringing me closer to the end of this twisted chapter. Finally, with one last surge of strength, I managed to throw him off me. Mark collapsed onto the floor, panting, his rage spent. I stood over him, breathing heavily, the reality of the situation sinking in. Jessica rushed to my side, her eyes wide with fear and anger. "Get out, Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "We're done. It's over." Mark glared at both of us, his eyes burning with resentment. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but his threats felt empty now. He picked himself up and staggered out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. As the dust settled, Jessica and I stood there, catching our breath. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving us both shaken. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but there was no turning back now. Jessica wrapped her arms around me, and we held each other in the aftermath of the chaos, knowing that whatever happened next, we were in this together. The fight with Mark left the apartment in disarray, broken furniture, scattered clothes, and the unmistakable tension of what had just happened. Jessica and I sat on the edge of her bed, catching our breath as the adrenaline slowly faded. My knuckles were bruised and sore, a painful reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. Jessica looked shaken, her eyes still wide with fear and lingering anger. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice unsteady as she reached out to touch my hand. I nodded, though my mind was still racing. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Physically, I was bruised but intact. Emotionally, I felt a strange mix of vindication and regret. I hadn't planned for things to spiral this far, but here we were, standing in the wreckage of what used to be our lives. Jessica leaned her head against my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. "I didn't think he'd show up. I thought he'd given up after everything." "It's not your fault," I replied, wrapping an arm around her. "Mark was always going to find a way to make this worse. That's just who he is." We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other in the quiet aftermath of the fight. The reality of what had happened hung between us like a heavy curtain, but there was no going back now. I knew that whatever had existed between Mark and Jessica, whatever I had shared with Sarah, was dead. All that was left were two people trying to find solace in each other after being torn apart by betrayal. Eventually, we cleaned up the apartment, the silence between us comfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. I could feel Jessica watching me, her gaze full of questions she hadn't yet asked. As we finished, she finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. "What now? Where does this leave us?" It was the question I had been avoiding, but one that I knew we couldn't ignore forever. "I don't know," I admitted, leaning against the counter. "I didn't plan for any of this. I needed something real after everything that happened." Jessica nodded, biting her lip. "I get it. I feel the same way. But I don't want this to be just some reaction to everything that's happened, you know?" Her honesty was refreshing, a stark contrast to the lies and half-truths that had defined my relationship with Sarah. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't want that either," I said, meaning every word. "But I also don't want to rush into anything. We've both been through hell, and maybe we just need to take this one step at a time. She smiled, a small but genuine expression that warmed the cold edges of my heart. Yeah, one step at a time, she agreed. Over the next few weeks, Jessica and I spent more time together, but we kept things simple. We didn't try to define what was happening between us or force a label on it. We were just two people trying to navigate the wreckage of our pasts while slowly building something new. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was more than I could say about anything else that had happened in my life recently. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling to hold her own life together. She reached out a few times, sending messages asking if we could talk, but I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to open that door again. I needed distance, time to heal without her pulling me back into the mess she'd created. The few times we did speak, it was strained, and I could tell she was desperate to find a way back to what we had lost. But I couldn't give that to her, not anymore. Mark's situation continued to deteriorate. His career was in ruins, and with the divorce finalized, he was left with little more than his tarnished reputation. He had tried to contact Jessica a few times, attempting to apologize, but she shut him down every time. She was done with him, just as I was done with Sarah. One afternoon, Jessica and I were sitting at a cafe, enjoying the rare quiet moments we had found together. She glanced at me, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. So, do you think they'll ever figure it out? That this whole thing started because of that damn swinger party? I chuckled, shaking my head. I doubt it. People like Mark and Sarah, they're too busy blaming everyone else to ever look at themselves. Jessica laughed, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like things were going to be okay. We weren't perfect, and neither of us was under any illusions that we'd suddenly found our happily ever after. But we had each other, and that was enough for now. As we walked out of the cafe, I felt lighter, like a weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. The pain of Sarah's betrayal was still there, but it didn't define me anymore. I had a chance to start over, and maybe, just maybe, Jessica and I could find some kind of happiness in the ashes of what we had lost. We strolled along the waterfront, hand in hand, the sun setting in a brilliant display of colors. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Jessica squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, both of us silently promising to take things one day at a time. As we stood there, watching the waves crash against the rocks, I realized that life goes on. We had been knocked down, betrayed, and broken, but we were still here. And sometimes that was enough.